All right, everybody, get ready because today we're diving headfirst into a wild legal case from the Philippines. We're going to break down an alleged unfair dismissal, untangle the arguments from both sides, and uncover exactly what went down.
Should be interesting. Cases like this always have some hidden twists.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
So picture this. You've been working as a housekeeper for a company for a whole decade, right? Then bam, you're suddenly out of a job. That's exactly what happened to Marlon Buciel Agapito. He filed this complaint against his former employer, Aeroplus Multi-Services, saying they basically kicked him to the curb illegally.
Yeah, I actually remember hearing about this case. Wasn't it bounced around a few different courts?
It totally did. Each side had their own story, their own version of events. It's like a legal tug of war, right?
Exactly. So where do we even start with this whole thing? What actually happened in the first place?
Well, it sounds like it all started with Agapito raising concerns about, well, unfair treatment at a company meeting. He was particularly vocal about some employees, seemingly getting away with being late.
That's always a recipe for some workplace drama.
No kidding. And things definitely got a little spicy between Agapito and his supervisor. Like, according to reports, he straight up challenged his supervisor, asking why some employees weren't being held accountable for, as he put it, tardiness.
Oh boy, and how'd that go down?
Well, the supervisor apparently shot back with, and I quote, "If you don't like my rules, get out of here."
Oof. Yeah, that's
I know, right? Sounds like a recipe for a hostile work environment, for sure.
totally. So I'm guessing things didn't exactly smooth over after that?
Not even close. Agapito understandably reported the whole incident to HR, hoping to, sort things out.
Makes sense. That's usually the next step.
But instead of things calming down, he got hit with a suspension.
Oh, wow. Seriously.
Yeah, and get this. When Agapito finally went back to work, guess what happened?
Let me guess. They fired him.
Bingo. They told him his services were no longer needed, said that management had lost trust in him.
Wow. So they suspended him and then fired him because
Huh.
he complained about what sounded like preferential treatment.
Seems that way, right? But the question is, were those few heated words, even from the supervisor, enough to justify actually firing Agapito?
That's the million-dollar question, and that's where Philippine labor law comes into play.
Exactly. And that's where your expertise comes in. So what does Philippine law actually have to say about all of this?
So we've got Agapito in a tough spot, right? Feels like he's been wronged, loses his job, and what does he do? He decides to fight back, takes the case to court.
And this is where Philippine labor law gets really interesting. It's not like in some places where your boss can just say, "You're out of here," and that's it, case closed.
Oh, not at all. The Philippines actually has some pretty strong laws in place to protect employees from unfair dismissal.
Exactly. It's not a free-for-all for employers.
Nope, not even close. They have to prove they have what's called just cause to let someone go.
Just cause.
We're talking serious stuff, like
Hmm.
actual misconduct, fraud, things like that.
So not just everyday disagreements or personality clashes.
Not even close. And even if there was something like misconduct, it's not just what an employee did, it's how the whole dismissal was handled. There are rules about due process, giving the employee a chance to defend themselves.
Right. Everyone deserves a fair shake.
Exactly. So in Agapito's case, the first stop was going before the labor arbiter.
Okay, so for those of us not familiar with Philippine labor law, what exactly is a labor arbiter?
Basically, think of it as the first judge in these kinds of cases.
Gotcha.
And get this, the labor arbiter actually sided with Agapito.
No way. They sided with the employee, the housekeeper, not the big company.
They did. They found that Aeroplus, the employer, didn't follow the right procedures when they dismissed Agapito.
Interesting. So even if they had a reason to let him go, they messed up the process.
That's what it sounds like, yeah. And here's the thing. The labor arbiter didn't just say, okay, pay him back what you owe him and we're done. They also awarded Agapito damages.
Damages on top of his back pay, what does that mean exactly?
It means they recognized that Agapito wasn't just out some paychecks, there was harm done. They called out the spiteful and wanton manner of the dismissal.
Wow, spiteful and wanton manner. Those are strong words.
Right. It makes you think about how the whole thing went down, the way Agapito was spoken to, that whole get-out-of-here attitude.
Yeah, definitely seems like more than just a simple misunderstanding.
Exactly. So you'd think that's it, right? Case closed, Agapito wins.
That's what I'd assume, especially with those strong words from the labor arbiter.
Well, buckle up because this is where we get a real plot twist.
Oh, I love a good plot twist. What happened?
Remember those sworn statements we mentioned earlier? The ones from the supervisor and the HR rep? denying Agapito's version of the story.
Yeah, those seemed kind of important.
Well, this is where those statements really come into play.
They do?
They do. Because get this, those statements weren't presented at the initial hearing, only later on, during the appeals process.
Interesting. So they kind of held on to that information. Why would they do that?
That's a great question, and it gets to the heart of why this case is legally fascinating.
Okay, so last we left off, those late statements had really shaken things up. Agapito's initial win gets overturned, and the case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. Talk about pressure. So what happened? What did the Supreme Court make of it all, those late statements?
Well, they definitely weren't thrilled about how those statements just kind of appeared out of nowhere.
Right. Seemed like a pretty big deal.
It is. Remember, we were talking about due process? Everyone deserves a fair chance. And part of that is having all the evidence out in the open right from the start.
Totally. So did the Supreme Court toss those statements out, for being so late?
It's actually more nuanced than that, which is why this case is so interesting. The Supreme Court, they actually said that they get it, labor courts, they shouldn't be bogged down by super strict procedural rules. Like sometimes new evidence does come up and it needs to be considered.
Okay, so there's some wiggle room. It's not always black and white.
Exactly. It's about balance.
Yeah.
The court basically drew a line in the sand. They said, look, we understand that things happen, but you can't just spring new evidence on someone without a really good reason.
And in Agapito's case, did they think Aeroplus had a really good reason?
That's the thing. They didn't. They weren't convinced at all.
What? So even though the Supreme Court's saying these labor courts can bend the rules a bit, they thought this was too much.
That's exactly how it went down.
Yeah.
Remember how those statements from the supervisor and HR contradicted what Agapito had been saying all along?
Yeah, and it seemed super convenient for Aeroplus. Like it only came out when it benefited them.
The Supreme Court picked up on that too. They actually called those late statements self-serving, basically suggesting that maybe, just maybe, they weren't exactly the most accurate reflections of what happened back then.
So even if they didn't outright accuse anyone of lying, they made it pretty clear what they thought.
Exactly. And this part matters for a bigger reason too. See, the Supreme Court wasn't just focused on the nitty-gritty of this case. They were setting a precedent.
Right. What they decide here impacts future cases too.
Exactly. They were sending a clear message about fairness in all legal proceedings. You can't just change the narrative midway through because it suits you.
That makes sense. So after all that back and forth, after the Supreme Court weighed in on everything, what happened to Agapito? Did he get his job back?
So it's a little bittersweet. The Supreme Court, they actually sided with Aeroplus on the whole, did his conduct justify getting fired question.
Oh, wow. Really? So even with all that talk about due process, they still sided with the company on the actual firing.
Yeah. But here's the catch, and it's a big one. The Supreme Court also found that Aeroplus did illegally dismiss Agapito by not following the proper procedures.
So it's like they messed up even though they maybe had a reason to let him go in the first place?
Exactly. It's a bit of a mixed bag, but the Supreme Court didn't let Aeroplus off the hook.
So what happened? Did Agapito get anything?
Oh, he definitely did. The court ordered Aeroplus to pay up, and I'm talking a hefty sum. Back pay, damages, legal fees, the whole shebang.
Wow, that's a pretty big win, even if he didn't get his job back.
Right. It really highlights how crucial it is to handle employee dismissals the right way, by the book. Even if you think you're in the right, even if you have a good reason, you got to follow the process.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it, folks. What started as a seemingly simple case of unfair dismissal turned into this legal odyssey, went all the way to the highest court in the land.
And it really makes you think, right, about power dynamics at work, about due process, fairness, all of it.
It really does. And for me, it really highlights how essential a fair hearing is no matter what. Even in a system like law where I imagine efficiency is key, we can't lose sight of justice,
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, that wraps up our deep dive into this fascinating case from the Philippines, a story of alleged unfair dismissal, a legal battle, and a Supreme Court decision that really puts due process in the spotlight. What are your thoughts on the court's decision to side with Aeroplus on the dismissal itself? Head over to our social media and tell us what you think. And while you're at it, check out our other episodes where we break down even more complex legal cases, just like this one. Until next time, stay curious.